Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining what is session 4 of the HJI International Conference on Peace and Public Leadership, addressing the challenges of our time. I'm Thomas Walsh, president of HJI. We had a wonderful set of opening sessions last night, one on unification worldview and conflict transformation, the other on Christology and women, its relevance for peace. And now we're in session 4. The topic is philosophical issues in religion and peace. Thank you all for being here. I'm happy to introduce our first co-moderator for this important session that was put together by Dr. Keisuke Node, who is our professor of philosophy and associate provost at HJI. But our moderator is Ms. Angelika Buczynski, executive assistant to the president and director of special projects at HJI. Ms. Buczynski.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining our HJI International Conference, and in particular, our session on philosophical issues in religion and peace. Today, both panelists will underscore the urgency of critically examining and evolving philosophical underpinnings to navigate contemporary global challenges. So this will indeed be a stimulating session. I am Angelika Buczynski, and I will be your moderator for part 1. Before I introduce our first panelist, let me mention a few housekeeping details. First of all, we do plan to have time for Q&A after each panelist. Therefore, please post your questions and comments in the chat box. And please give your name and affiliation so we may address you appropriately. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Also, please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted on our HJI YouTube channel following the conference. We have excellent speakers for today's session. Each will speak for around 25 minutes. And again, we will have the floor open for question and answers after each presentation. Thank you again for joining us today. And thanks to all those who helped organize today's program. Now it gives me pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ronald Brown, Professor of History and Political Science at Touro University. You may kindly see the chat column where his bio will be posted, and Dr. Brown will be presenting on religion, peace, and war in the Third Millennium. Dr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me and see the screen?
Yes.
Good. All right. So this is just the first slide here. Shows a picture of me and then the moderator, and then this will be the second part will be Dr. Noda.
Dr. Brown, we're not seeing your slides. We see you perfectly. We hear you perfectly.
Let me see. Show. Okay. Slideshow. Can you see them now?
No.
You need to share your screen.
That's what I thought. Okay, and show. Share. All right. Okay, Zoom. Can you see it now?
Yes. Oh, wait a minute. Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. For
you
slide.
just need to go to click slideshow and then from beginning.
Okay. Is it still there?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Okay. Well, this first slide was just a little bit of what is going to be going on in this session. Now, my theme is Holy Wars in the Third Millennium. There's me working with the boat people from Vietnam. So I've been involved in the aftermath of wars. And my theme today is going to be that wars in the third millennium are going to be unlike any wars we have seen in the past. So the outline, the end of religion, the God-empowered state, the rise of the super-empowered individual, and then the need for a new axial age. People have been declaring religion dead for quite some time. Well, in the ancient times, religion and government were linked, whether it's the Japanese emperor as a descendant of the sun god, or whether it is God promising holy lands to people and waging holy wars. Throughout human history, religion and government have been inseparable. Well, of course, then there was the attempt to control religions, to bring them under the authority of the state, whether it is the French Revolution, American idea of separation of church and state, to privatize religion, or Karl Marx going and declaring religion as dead, to stamp it out. And so the modern secular state has attempted to exclude religion from the political system. Following World War II, when we had countries like India and Africa, after World War I, the beginning of Zionism, secularization in Turkey, these countries basically adopted the Western secular model. Exclude religion from government, deprive it of any way of influencing government, privatize it. What you did on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday in your house of worship was your own business, and it had absolutely no relevance to politics. In fact, many people said God is dead. The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama celebrated the Western liberal democracy's separation of church and state, freedom of religion. So that's where we were until very recently. But God has not remained quiet. And so God has come roaring back into the political system. Books such as God is Back, How the Global Rise of Faith is Changing the World, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals, linking up first with Ronald Reagan, and then, as we see today, with Donald Trump, the union of church and state. And so, as the book on the right, The Secular State Under Siege, this is a global phenomenon of religion and politics coming back together, the decline of the secular state. Well, it became serious with, of course, the Islamic Revolution, where the Shah, who was a secularist, even anti-Islamic, was overthrown by the Ayatollahs, and the theocratic state of Iran was born. The election of Menachem Begin following the Yom Kippur War in Israel, linking the secular state of Israel with the rising religious right wing, what we call the New Orthodox. Presidents such as Donald Trump, using the Bible. In fact, I'm sure you all know that for a mere $60, you can have an autographed Bible by Donald Trump. Now, we're not to the point where it's going to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Donald, a new gospel, but we see the linking up again of church and state. I call these God-empowered states. When we see in India, under the BJP, I am a patriot, I am nationalist, I am born Hindu. The turn of Turkey, once fiercely secular, going back now under Erdogan to being an Islamic state. in Bolsonaro's Brazil, once again linking up the secular state with religious underpinnings. And Bolsonaro, like Donald Trump, was a strong believer in this new evangelical Christian movement. The rise of Jewish Zionism in Israel, where it is no longer a national conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, but it is becoming a global conflict between Judaism and Islam, as we see where Netanyahu using Bible quotations to justify his brutal war in Gaza, saying that the Palestinians are the descendants of the Amalekites, and God instructed the Jews to exterminate them. Now, in many of these cases, especially with Donald Trump and Netanyahu, you often wonder whether it is a presidential candidate simply using religion to rally his support. Well, in many cases, that might be the case, as in Bolsonaro using religion to reinforce his power. I always use the expression, when the going gets tough, the tough get God. Because if you are a secular nationalist, you can compromise. But if you are a religious nationalist, you don't compromise with God. So even in Israel, the secular vision of Herzl, what was his major accomplishment? Was building the city of Tel Aviv, the Hill of Spring. When you walk down Dizengoff, that is a celebration of Herzl's secular vision. He insisted on his main drag in Tel Aviv, it would be a Western American European style city. That's why there are no synagogues on Dizengoff Street. Total secularized government. Well, today we are long beyond Herzl. I'm sure he's turning over in his grave when he sees what happens. And this is a major issue in Israel. And this was his famous quote from the Amalekites: totally destroy all that belongs to them, put to death the men, the women, the children, the infants, the cattle, the sheep, the camels, and the donkeys. And when you look at what Netanyahu is doing in Gaza, you realize that the secular state has been replaced by as close as we can come to a theocracy. Well, this is not just limited to countries like the United States with the evangelicals, or Brazil, or even Mexico, or it is not limited to Israel or Iran. This blending of religion and politics giving rise to God-empowered states is a global phenomenon. When I was in southern Thailand, the Muslim part of Thailand, I would see Buddhist monks walking the streets with submachine guns. The government built giant statues of Buddha right across the square from the mosques in the entire area of southern Thailand. Myanmar expelling the Muslim Rohingyas. Again, Thailand is make Thailand Buddhist again. In Myanmar, it is make Myanmar Buddhist again. And so these are religious wars. And as we saw with the decline and disappearance of Yugoslavia, when religion and politics come together, these wars are especially brutal, especially ruthless. One of the aspects of this holy war is the mass destruction of houses of worship. We often see mosques and synagogues and churches being defaced, but holy places are a symbol of the presence of a religion, and they are to be destroyed. At the top, you see Narwithia. In southern Thailand, a giant statue of the Buddha put up in a park in a city which is 95% Muslim. And Ayodhya in India, the destruction of a centuries-old mosque and its replacement by a Hindu temple on the birthplace of the god Ram. You see the desecration of churches and mosques in Israel. In the United States and in Europe, the desecration of synagogues. And I'm afraid that in the third millennium, we're probably going to see the destruction of the mosques of Jerusalem. These are prime targets, the visual reminders that there are Muslims and Christians in Hindu India, or there are people of different religions. So the wars in the third millennium are going to be very, very bloody. They are going to be ruthless, and they are going to target visual reminders of what was once celebrated as religious diversity. Of course, we all know Samuel P. Huntington, who prophesied back in the 1990s that the third millennium is going to be marked by the clash of civilizations. Now, I knew Samuel P. Huntington. He was at Harvard when I was there. And I remember reading his article in Foreign Affairs magazine. The title of his first article was The Clash of Civilizations, followed by a question mark. Well, then, of course, he got peer review. So when he came out with the book in the 1990s, the question mark had disappeared. Well, I would rewrite it today, and I would say it's no longer the clash of civilizations, but it's the clash of religions as they vie for world domination. When you look at the evangelical Christian missionaries flooding the world, Muslim uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, the persecution of Christians and Muslims in India. So it's going to be a pretty lively third millennium. Now, another very important aspect of the third millennium is the rise of what Thomas Friedman calls the super-empowered individual. New actors are on the stage. When it's a nation state, it is religion, mainly a traditional religion. But with the rise of super-empowered individuals, you get Burmese monks like Wirathu, you get Osama bin Laden, you get new actors on the stage. And in fact, what we see in the Gaza war, it is the nation state of Israel fighting against a new religious movement called Hamas. With globalization, religions are going global. You have not only the global economic products going around the world, global education, like me, BA in the United States, an MA into Hebrew University, a second MA at Harvard, and a PhD from Geneva, the perfect global citizen. And so religions are going global in what Thomas Friedman called a flat world. Everything moves. Massive Muslim migration to the United States and especially to Europe. In fact, millions of Muslims are migrating to Russia from Central Asia. and they are the fastest growing religious group in Russia. The superpowered individual now has access to technology. Think of how technology has influenced Christianity. It spread along the Roman network of roads and trading channels. Martin Luther translating the Bible and producing it in cheap printed editions in German. Ideas, religions go through the internet, the laptop, and satellites. An individual who can master the modern technology can become a superpowered individual. Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was a master of modern communications, modern technology, accessing arms, communications, raising huge amounts of money from around the world. Israeli settlers defying their own government to build rogue settlements all over the West Bank. And think of the role of Israeli settlers. Don't forget, it was British settlers who took over South Africa and introduced apartheid. Think of the war in Algeria, where the French were getting out of Algeria, but it was the settlers who ended up unleashing one of the most bloody wars. These are super empowered individuals. Google, ATMs, all kinds of viruses. I love that picture in the middle where you see an African tribesman with his cattle out in the middle of nowhere. And I don't know if he's calling out for a pizza or whether he's calling his mother or buying stock on the stock market. But everybody has access to modern technology. You can establish your own army. Think of Blackwater. We call them mercenary armies. The Jewish Defense League, ISIS, the IRA. We think of the Wagner Group, how important the Wagner movement was in spreading its own vision of the future in Africa. So non-state actors are increasing in importance. Now, I did notice that at 10 o'clock, the next speaker is going to be talking about new religious movements and contemporary threats to religious freedom. Well, my view is these new non-state actors, religious leaders, such as the Lubavitchers in the Jewish movement, these are going to be increasingly influential actors on the stage, where you see so many Catholics leaving the Catholic Church and joining the evangelicals, or you see secular Jews who are joining some of the new religious movements inside Judaism. And so the future is going to be one of some very, very serious world conflicts. And it's not going to be just the nation state, but it's going to be super empowered oligarchs who are amassing power. Musk has his own foreign policy. He is engaged in the war in Ukraine, supplying technological and communications devices. So the wars of the future are not going to be just plain old nation states anymore, but they are going to be more and more non-state actors, super empowered individuals who can declare war. Think of the September 11 in New York. This was a war between the United States government and a new religious movement with super empowered individuals as major actors on the stage. And these wars are going to be more bloody than the past because it is religious inspired. The only other example we have of a very bloody religious war launched by a religious group are the famous Crusades, where the popes mobilized armies, sent them off, and as we know from the Crusades, it was a religious war with the mass slaughter of Jews, of Muslims, and of Orthodox Christians, probably one of the most bloody wars. And so the wars are going to be bloody. They are going to be ruthless. So the Third Millennium Wars, it is going to be, of course, states and countries are going to be involved, but more and more God-empowered individuals or non-state actors, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, Boko Haram, the Houthis, Abu Sayyaf, in Muslim countries where they are literally at war with the Western-supported nation states. Now, as Dr. Noda is going to bring up when I am finished, the whole issue of how should philosophers, how should theologians discuss war and peace. War is a constantly evolving phenomenon. And like they say with generals, they're always fighting the last war. The theologians, the philosophers, the peace activists of today have to realize that we are entering a new age of warfare. It is no longer country against country. It is going to be new groups, new religious movements which emerge, super empowered individuals, where you have ISIS declaring war against the United States. So it's going to be a pretty bloody future.
Dr. Brown, you have 3 minutes remaining.
3 minutes, thank you. So, are we in need of a new axial age? Can humanity overcome this constant fascination and need for war? Can war be rooted out of our religions? I mean, look at how important warfare is in Christianity, whether it's soldiers of God, the watchtower announcing Jehovah's kingdom, a watchtower. It's a military establishment. Onward, Christian soldiers. Warfare is so deeply rooted in religions. And Judaism, as we see, quoting the Bible to justify what's going on in Gaza, Christians launching war. Can we start thinking globally? Can we overcome the tribalism of our religions? Or maybe it's time to junk the major religions of the world and look towards new religious movements as possibly having a global consciousness. So that's a fundamental question. Can warfare be rooted out of religions? I think Jesus and the Buddha both attempted to sever the ancient link between religion and politics. But as we all know, Christianity ended up being co-opted by Constantine, and now you have religious leaders such as Putin in Russia using orthodoxy as a weapon of war. And so, $1 million question, is it time in this for a new axial age where we can maybe junk the religions of the past as being totally compromised and maybe look towards new religious movements as offering an alternative. So for HJ International, School of Peace and Public Leadership, it is very important to look at the third millennium and say, what is warfare? Know your enemy is what they say. Know who you are fighting against when you become a campaigner for peace. Is there going to be a 21st century? Are we going to survive into the third millennium? These are the most important questions facing humanity today. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for your presentation. I have a lot of notes, and I'm sure we all took away valuable content and have great things to think about further. We will now have open discussion and questions and answers. So everyone, if you could please post your comments and questions in the chat column. I see we already have some to begin with. Dr. Brown, if you would like to, you could stop sharing your screen as well.
Okay, there we go.
And our first question here is from Dr. Thomas Ward. He says, Dr. Brown, would you consider American secularism, Mao Zedong, Xi Jinping thoughts, and the woke movement to be religions as well?
Okay, could you repeat that question?
Yes, sorry. Would you consider American secularism, Mao Zedong, Xi Jinping thoughts, and the woke movement to be religions as well?
Yes. Now, when you say religions, a very important concept I've really appreciated is when people say, how do you do religion? I was raised Catholic. So doing Catholicism when I was a kid was no meat on Friday, calling up Father Griffin to see if the movie in our local movie theater was agreeable. My mother was Catholic Daughters and my father was Knights of Columbus. That was doing Catholicism. Whereas I think today we are reinterpreting what it means to do religion. What I think Israelis are doing in Gaza is doing Judaism as they understand it in the third millennium. What Chinese are doing, they are I would consider Confucianism a religion. Communism is a religion because it is future-oriented. It is utopian, creating a perfect society here on earth. The only difference between Confucianism and Catholicism is in Catholicism, you go to heaven, hopefully when you die, whereas in Confucianism, you build your heaven or hell here on earth. So there are different ways of doing religion in a very broad sense.
Thank you. Dr. Thomas Walsh says, Dr. Brown, excellent presentation, very well organized with wonderful graphics. Religious resurgence and religious decline seem to both be at play in different geopolitical spheres. In terms of conflict and violence and its causes, how would you rank the impact of religion as a generator of conflict relative to ethnic or tribal interests or relative to secular nationalist ideologies?
Well, as I said early on, you don't compromise with God. If you are a secular nationalist and you invade your neighbor, it is to get land, get population, get resources, and so you can compromise. And there we see that in the Ukraine war. You can compromise, and it might not be to everybody's satisfaction. But when it is a religious war, the religious wars tend to last longer, be more brutal. And as we see from the Jewish Bible, I mean, all of the commands by God to exterminate, not just the Amalekites. Don't forget when King David conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites. He exterminated all of the adults and sold the children as slaves. So religious wars tend to be longer. They tend to be brutal. There was the Department of Defense, I have the article here, did a study on wars in the future. And they said they are going to be longer, they're going to be more brutal and more devastating.
Yes, thank you. Peter May from Germany asks, and I would like to add, we humans, for what should we finally aim for? What does history teach us out of all these controversies?
Well, it asks a very serious question. As I said at the end of my presentation, can violence and wars and genocides, can they be rooted out of the human consciousness? And that's why I talk about an axial age, because for the first time in history, we have to seriously start thinking globally, and we have to overcome our tribalism, our racism. Now, if you watch science fiction movies, you find very often that humans will not root this out. You look at Star Wars, even the title means that warfare is so deeply rooted in humanity that maybe we are not salvageable. If aliens come, they might find that humans are a race of creatures who should be exterminated. Read Isaac Asimov and other writers who are very pessimistic about the survival of humans in the future.
Interesting points, thank you. Dr. Mickler says Huntington ended his book with a call to civilization coexistence. He states the constructive course is to renounce universalism, accept diversity, and seek commonalities. How does that square with your vision?
Well, the title, Clash of Civilizations, Samuel P. Huntington argues what he said are bloody borders. He believed very much that Western Europe and the United States, as well as Australia, should stop accepting non-Christian immigrants, that those who are here should be expelled, so that Western Europe is a pure Western Christian empire. Just the same with Russia, should not be accepting Muslims or Protestants or Catholics. It is the Orthodox world. So he is very pessimistic because he believes that countries like the United States will end up destroying themselves because they're not remaining loyal to their civilization. They are diluting it. And this is very much a theme in the Republican Party of building walls. State of Israel, a Jewish state, Jewish symbols, even though with the occupied territories, Muslims are 52% of the state of Israel, and the Jews are a minority. And they are, this mixing is what Samuel P. Huntington was viciously opposed to, immigration reform. Donald Trump swears on anything Samuel P. Huntington wrote because he believes in the whole issue of replacement, where white Protestant and Christian Americans are becoming a minority in their own country, and that is not sustainable, according to Huntington.
Thank you. In the interest of time, just a friendly reminder to keep your answer as brief as possible so we can try to get through some of these. The next question is from Thomas from Germany. Dr. Brown, what do you think is the main means to avoid warlike solutions and steer towards peaceful relationships?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And attempts to limit armaments, the spread of atomic bombs, and to try to replace those. I'm not. I don't really see much hope in interreligious dialogue, because those who enter into religious dialogue usually already agree on everything and just sit around drinking coffee or beer. But how are we going to be able to overcome this innate human desire and need for warfare? I am rather pessimistic.
And one final question from Dr. Theodore Shimyo. Do all religions cause wars and conflicts? What kind of religion, if any, would be able to avoid war and conflict?
Well, I firmly believe the two of the greatest teachers in this area were the Buddha and Christianity. When Christ clearly said, "My kingdom is not of this world," he was trying to separate religion and government, which was so linked in Judaism that he attempted to separate them, and he failed. He didn't fail, but Christianity was co-opted by Holy Roman empires, by Russia as a third Rome, Constantine, and the same thing with the Buddha. It became Theravada Buddhism, where I was in Thailand for the crowning of the new king. I mean, it was all Buddhist monks, and he took the name Ram, which is the Hindu god. And these were two attempts to separate this religion and politics, and both ended up being pretty much co-opted, and so they were failures. Now, maybe a new prophet is going to come, and we move into it, and we need a new axial age, a new beginning. Maybe we need a whole different approach to religion that will come from new religious movements, which are proving very, very insightful into the current human situation.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, and thank you, everyone. I know there were a lot of fantastic questions. I apologize that the time did not allow us to address all of them, but I would now like to ask Dr. Brown to give his final remarks.
Well, my final remark is, I just turned 75 years old. I'm a baby boomer. I'll probably be here another 20 years, but it is the younger generations. It is the students at HJI International. It is my students at Touro University who are the key to the future. Are they going to be able to move us into a new axial age, come up with new ideas, create a global consciousness that is no longer tribal or national? So I'm hopeful for the next generation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. As others have mentioned, it has been very thought-provoking. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. I would now like to turn to our next moderator for part 2 of this session, Ms. Mi-Young Eaton, Secretary General of the Research Institute for the Integration of World Thought and doctoral student at HJI. You may kindly see the chat column where her bio will be posted. And now let's welcome Mi-Young.
Yes, thank you, Angelika, and thank you, Dr. Brown, for your presentation. Of course, very thought-provoking this morning. It is good to be here with you both and with everyone who's joined our call today. Thank you for joining our early morning session. For me, for many, and of course, other times, many people are joining from around the world. We're in different time zones here. So thank you for being with us at this time. And without further ado, it is my honor to introduce the next speaker for our session, Dr. Keisuke Noda. Dr. Keisuke Noda is Professor of Philosophy and Associate Provost at HJI. His area of specialty is phenomenology and hermeneutics, and his most recent research focuses on Viktor Frankl. And you can find more details about Dr. Noda's bio in the chat. And so with that being said, let us please welcome up Dr. Keisuke Noda for our next presentation this morning. Dr. Noda.
Thank you, Mi-Young, and thank you everyone for joining. Do you see slides?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. So my topic is a philosophical issue for the advancement of unificationism to the socio-political sphere. And I'm focusing on more on the theoretical side. And unification thought, developed by Dr. Sahandi, is the official philosophical exposition of unificationism. And unification ethics is formulated as a family virtue ethics, a type of normative ethics. And if unification thought envisions advancing into the socio-political spheres, it needs a political philosophy. And this presentation is an attempt to identify key philosophical issues unification thought will encounter. And although there are some socio-political concepts in unification thought, such as headwinds and a principle of mutual existence and so forth, mutuality principles, what these concepts mean in the context of political philosophy is uncertain. And since the centrality of family in unificationism is unquestionable, and ethics and political philosophy are intertwined, I begin with unification ethics. And this presentation is meant to be a conversation starter or throwing a lot of questions rather than making a definitive claim and take a hermeneutic approach. So this presentation will cover first strengths and the challenges of family virtue ethics, which is unification ethics, in reference to Confucianism, care ethics, feminist ethics, and Western political philosophy. And the second, I touch upon the recent promotion of Confucianism by Chinese government. And I take a brief look at John Rawls' approach to justice. And a number of challenges were made to John Rawls. So I highlight those challenges, including the point that Dr. Brown mentioned, and how John Rawls responded to those questions. And finally, I conclude by identifying the philosophical question unification will face if it envisions developing its political philosophy, and particularly a theory of justice. So landscape of ethics is basically there are two ways to approach ethics, normative ethics and meta-ethics. And normative ethics is an ethical theory that can provide a principle, a way to make a decision. And there are three kinds: Kantian ethics of duty, Dr. Perrotin pointed out, and utilitarianism and virtue ethics. And political philosophy roughly linked to those ethical perspectives. And there's another approach to ethics that's a critical reflection of ethics, such as origin of moral authority. And as Dr. Brown pointed out, religious virtue ethics are backed up by divine command theories. But the question is that a divine command or a social contract? Or what is the origin of moral authority? Or other questions, the nature of moral principles. Catholic takes naturalism, and the deconstructionist takes a constructivist approach. And there are a lot of questions on meta-ethics. And John Rawls, for example, developed his version of liberalism on social contract theory. So let's see unification ethics, family virtue ethics. Strengths. A family is a natural place where humans are born to grow and die. So who cares about your life, living or dying? It's a family. And it is a primary place where human beings cultivate moral characters over time in growth. And stable families can enhance a society's social cohesion and moral flourishing. In developing in political philosophy, communitarians recognize the value of family in developing moral character and virtuous communities. And care ethics, feminist ethics, for example, point out interdependency of human existence against the concept of independent, autonomous, self-sufficient individual, of moral individualism. And they identify emotional feelings, love and care as central to human existence. They challenge Kant and others' rational being model and take family as a primary place for the development of moral characters. And Confucianism is another big one. And a family is the central social unit. And a concept of family is extended to ancestors and descendants, and extended family by varying the blood lineage and the blood relationships, not the nucleus families, a much broader concept of family. And marriage is a key linkage between families, not the private romantic matter, but the link of the family and families. Challenges is, how do we position the family in the social and the political sphere? One way, there are two ways. One is to position the family as a social unit within a democratic society. This is the way care ethics does. The care ethics was adapted as a professional ethics, and the caring professionals often use it for nursing and elderly care and so forth. But there is another way. Position the family as a model for social political structure. Apply a family model to social governance. And this is a classic traditional Confucian model, and by emperor's rule or feudalism. And if you look at North Korea, while they adapt the socialism, but the Kim family presented themselves as a kind of parents, and people are children. So every family should have a picture of Kim, and they should have a filial piety to Kim, and the hereditary succession, and they have a privilege. They are privileged families, and this is not a part of any part of Marxism. So what are the problems of making family virtue ethics the governing theory of the state in relation to Western political philosophy? All theories of justice presuppose the separation of the public sphere from the private sphere. Family is a private sphere. Justice as a fairness must be established in the public sphere. So, for example, in Plato, in his philosopher king model, guardians and military, Plato argued, should not have private families. They can't marry. And the people at the bottom, they can have families. And Aristotle, as you know, he developed the various concepts of justice, distributive justice, collective justice, and ideas of division of power, check and balance, and others. But while he recognized the critical role of family, he placed the family in the private sphere based on the very clear distinction between the public and the private. So when family virtue ethics is expanded to the public sphere, it encounters the question of justice as a fairness. Let's consider impartiality. Virtues are basically group dependent, and even if you're virtuous, the question is, whom are you loyal to? And a conflict of virtue are inherent in virtue ethics, and often they value loyalty over performance, and love in the family is also partial. Care ethics, for example, recognize the partiality of love in the family. You care your spouse more than other men and women. If not, you are in a big trouble. You care your children more than other children. And they justify it. The partiality of care is proportionate to the responsibility and direct influences. Although care ethicists criticize Kant and other theories of justice as a male perspective, they cannot offer a comprehensive theory of justice, and they remain as a professional ethics within the democratic societies. And for Kant, universalizability, impartiality is a requisite for justice. And for that reason, rationality, they point out the rationality over interest, preference, and emotional feelings. Problem is, it can promote, justify in the public sphere favoritism.
In progress.
You value loyalty over performance, and nepotism, you value blood relations over other factors. And for example, Confucianism values blood relations. So the hereditary succession of powers, privilege, and social status by extended families. And some, like Richard Rorty, criticized its authoritarian governance. And here is an interesting passage from Confucius. And when your father stole a sheep, should the child tell it about it to the public? And Confucius says, no, don't. Conceal wrongdoing of your children, and children should not report about father's wrongdoings. And Mencius has a different version.
You congratulate. Since my last little notification, I do want to let you know that we're going to begin in about 2 minutes.
What is this? Mencius was asked, if the emperor knew his father killed somebody, what should he do? And look at the last passage, paragraph. Mencius replied, Shun would have viewed casting off the empire like casting off a worn-out shoe. He would secretly have borne his father on his back and fled until he came to dwell by the shore of the sea. There he would have lived in joyful contentment, having forgotten the empire. There are many interesting passages, but anyway, it showed us some spirit of Confucianism. And recently, Chinese government has been promoting Confucianism. And after Cultural Revolution, they made a turn. And since 2004, Confucian Institute was established at 550 locations in 162 countries. And for example, in Japan, 17 Confucian Institutes were established at the major universities in Japan through articulation agreement between Japanese universities and Chinese universities. And the faculty were sent by China, and their salary were paid by China. So, domestically, it serves for the stability of the country, establish a social cultural identity of Chinese people for social cohesion. And for globally, it's a long-term cultural strategy to establish a Chinese presence and build a network in the world. And also, they try to establish China, Korea, Japan as one civilizational unit against the rest of the world. But Japan and Korea are very careful because this strategy is China-centered, not coalition. So, but anyway, this is their strategy, cultural strategy. And Chinese political philosophers are struggling over the question of how they fit together socialism, market discourse, and Confucianism. So they have been having a dialogue with Western political philosophers. And for example, they invited, a number of universities invited Michael Sandel, a communitarian political philosopher. And one of the dialogue was published as a book in 2008. The approach to justice is usually shaped by how you weigh and realize values. Freedom, equality, and local values or common values specific to each community, religious community, ethnic, or gender, or families. John Rawls formulated a theory of justice in order to realize equality within the liberalist framework. So he left the local community values to each individual community, and which he called thin theory of the good, and I did not try to incorporate those values into his first formulation of justice. And this is his principle of justice. He primarily worked on the distributive justice in his theory of justice. The first principle is the principle of equal liberty. Each person has an equal claim to a fully adequate scheme of basic rights and liberties compatible with the same scheme for all. Second, social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. A, they are to be attached to positions and offices open to all under condition of fair equality of opportunity. And B, they are to be the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. And it's called the difference principle. So an agreement to regard the distribution of natural talent as a common asset and to share in the benefit of this distribution, whatever it turns out to be. So he views individual talent as the shared as well as theirs. So no one deserves his greater natural capacity, nor merits a more favorable starting place in society. But it does not follow that one should eliminate these distinctions. There is another way to deal with it. The basic structure of society can be arranged so that these contingencies work for the good of the least fortunate. And he put the value of ignorance and a kind of a thought experiment. And I suppose they chose the principle of justice from behind a veil of ignorance, where they did not know what their talents were or where they would be placed in society. They would choose a society that would be fair to all because they would have to live with their choice. So a fair society is one that any rational, self-interested person behind the veil of ignorance would want to join. So Rawls' argument is basically people will not choose the utilitarian principle because you may be born as a religious or ethnic minority, and you may be killed or tortured to death. And you will not choose libertarianism because you may be born as a child of Bill Gates, or you may be born as in a homeless family or a gang family or a refugee camp. So there are four rival theories for distributive justice: feudal system or caste system, libertarian, meritocracy, and egalitarians. And Rawls argued that each of the first three theories bases the distributive share on factors that are arbitrary from a moral point of view, whether accident of birth or social and economic advantage or natural talents and abilities. So classic Confucianism fall in number one. So Rawls focused on freedom and equality to formulate his theory of justice and left the local values to the choice of each individual or group of communities. So some group use this deconstructionist argument, such as Foucault and Derrida, and universalize their local values, as you can see in identity politics, and shape the framework of interpretations. But the bigger challenges are, communitarians. Michael Sandel, for example, argued that the society is built on some common good. He critiqued Rawls' concept of a human being as an unencumbered self, that is his word, and argued that the human being is a situated self, a relational being born into and living in the context of communities. So self-identity is formed through communal relations within communities. And LSD McIntyre, I believe McIntyre was a dissertation advisor of Dr. Walsh. So this is really actually his field. McIntyre presented the concept of narrative unity of human life that is interwoven into the social, cultural, and historical narratives of communities. And he incorporated the Aristotelian virtue ethics in his After Virtue. And this is the first book I had to read in ethics class at the graduate school. Now, the B challenge, second challenge, is something that Dr. Brown pointed out. From theocratic countries, theocratic groups, and some religious communities claim that exclusive superiority over their local values and the comprehensive doctrine. This is the Rawls term, comprehensive doctrine. And Jürgen Habermas, he also criticized Rawls' procedural approach as inadequate. It needs public deliberation and a public reason, communicative action, and rather than monological discourse. And Rawls responded to these challenges, and he presented the idea of overlapping consensus among people with different comprehensive doctrines. So he takes a little more practical approach, and he presented a shift in political liberalism from his earlier formulation in Theory of Justice. Two major shifts is justice from domestic context to global context. And the second, he presented the political concept of justice, political concept of justice, accessible to people with different comprehensive doctrines. And Richard Rorty also, approached from very different angle. And Richard Rorty is very, very well known for bridging two divided philosophical camps: analytic philosophy of Anglo-Saxon world and a continental philosophy. And he found the common theme between late Wittgenstein and late Heidegger, and combined with Dewey, pragmatism. And from after him, analytic philosophers and continental philosophers began to talk. Before him, they did not talk each other. And Rorty presented a pragmatic and hermeneutic approach in contrast to what he called epistemological approach. And he presented two different approaches. One is epistemological approach. It is based on the quest for the universal truth or knowledge and the consensus based upon it. And Rorty thinks it doesn't work. And he presented a hermeneutic approach, and beliefs, values, and political knowledge are contingent. And there is no single objective universal principle applicable to all. There is no one-size-fits-all theory, foundationalism, or grand narratives. So this is a more postmodern thought. And political values emerge out of conversation based on the mutual understanding, hermeneutics of the other's context. I think Dr. Word applied this, this in his presentation. So he argues we should seek the pragmatic approach, ongoing hermeneutics, embody pluralism of the final narrative of each religious, philosophical. Philosophical means ethnic, racial, range, gender, and a group and a community. We should also realize the contingency of our final narratives. And in 2004, a university in Shanghai, in China, invited Rorty and held a conference, Rorty, Pragmatism, and Chinese Philosophy. And it was published there. And while Rorty is critical of authoritarianism, limited individual autonomy, and value particularism in Confucianism, He found it a valuable alternative to the Western approach. He pointed out, while Western moral political philosophy is built on individual rights and autonomy, Confucianism presents relational views of human life, harmony, and the role of family in building virtuous characters and communities. And by the way, this fact, what you pointed out is this perspective is common to communitarianism. So, conclusion: what are the theoretical challenges for developing a political philosophy in Unificationism? First question is how to position its family virtue ethics and within democratic governance, like care ethics does, or make it the governing structure of the state or society. If so, how do you deal with the private-public distinction, and which is the fundamental assumption of political philosophy? And in the conferences, Chinese scholars cannot touch certain areas, governing structure and those kind of things. It's too dangerous.
Just
and
want
the
to mention
second,
3 minutes, Dr. Noda.
Okay. How to balance? Oh, by the way, one famous, well-known Chinese scholar in Japan, he has been teaching in Japan. He recently went back to China, and he disappeared. We have nothing about him, and we don't know where yet. So Chinese scholars are very careful, even at the conference, what to touch, what do not touch. So the second question is how to balance values such as freedom, equality, and local values, shared values in each religious community, ethnic, gender community, group, tradition, to develop a concept of justice. And a concept of justice or theory of justice is shaped based upon how to balance values and how to implement it. And what philosophical approach framework do you take? Epistemological approach or hermeneutic approach or else? This is Rorty's question. Do you need a public discourse? This is an argument Habermas gave against Rawls. And do you need to develop a pluralist concept of justice based on the multiple spheres of justice? This is Michael Rawls' critique of Rawls' singular principle of justice. And a concept of justice should be formulated according to different spheres in a power structure, distribution of the good, and education, and et cetera, et cetera. So should we apply a different pluralist concept of justice? So anyway, contextualizing unificationist ideas such as the family virtue ethics, hindering, and mutuality principle, and others in the debates in the political philosophy is, I believe, the starting point for identifying the nature and the locus of those ideas, and which requires a reflection of meta-ethical questions as well, as Dr. Brown pointed out, divine command ethics, or as Rawls did, social contract theory, or so those meta-ethical questions are also has to be considered as well. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Noda. Thank you very much for your presentation. So we'll move directly into Q&A now. We have a couple of questions in the chat, so I think we'll go ahead and start there. First, we'll go to Thomas from Germany. He asks, Dr. Noda, currently family modeled behaviors do migrate slowly into the public spheres of life as the application of restorative justice shows us. What do you think would be the proper family-based roles projection into social public structures? For instance, the North Korean government parental model doesn't seem to be a good example. So what might be a better example?
Yeah, interesting question. Concerning the two spheres, the public and the private, Richard Rorty's perspective is they are incommensurable. So he thinks it's not possible to create a theory to integrate the two spheres into and create a theoretical model. So he takes more pragmatic approach and to incommensurable spheres. So he takes a hermeneutic approach. So probably I think rather than epistemological approach, hermeneutic approach, taking up multiple values, accept the coexistence of multiple approaches, and so that kind of framework question, more basic attitude to the values is required. So I think I myself is in favor of hermeneutic approach. So, but it's a debatable question. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, yeah, and as you outlined, there is much debate, right, about these questions. So ongoing debate. So yeah, so I think we'll move on to the next question from Dr. Thomas Walsh. Dr. Walsh notes, Rawls and Habermas differentiate between a sphere of the right and justice on the one hand and a sphere of virtue, values, ethos, and tradition on the other. The former is more in ethics for the political sphere and the latter for the community or society. Is that a useful distinction in your view? So maybe even is the distinction itself valuable?
It is. And actually, this is Dr. Walsh's field. So yeah, I hope he would develop this approach. Thank you.
Yes, I feel like Dr. Walsh should be the one moderating today. It's just very natural. Wow, very natural would have been, but yeah. So we have another question here from Dr. Andrew Wilson. He says, I'm interested in care ethics and whether the question of whether it can be applied to governance. Have any care ethicists looked at political systems from the standpoint of care, discussion, consensus building, etc., which are useful in care as an alternative to political contests that can be cutthroat?
Yeah, they certainly, they certainly think that their, actually their approach is similar to communitarians, like consensus building and importance of, community building. And society itself should be built on some common good. That's a major argument of communitarians. So, and also communitarians are basically in favor of virtue ethics. So there are a lot of points they agree each other. So depends on the type of care ethicist. And if you are radical, feminist, they do not even use they attack the concept of justice and those vocabularies as male-dominated, tainted vocabularies, and they refuse it. But the moderate one, work on with the communitarians, and communitarians usually in favor of virtue ethics such as Aristotelians. So they value the importance of character building and creating, developing virtuous communities. Yeah. And they are, however, critical of procedural approach. But they point out even the walls, formulation has an implicit understanding of value perspectives there. So, and they some say John Rawls is a magician, and without using a language of those values, common good, they slide it into these formulations. So it's a lot of fruitful discussions among those people. Yeah. McIntyre, Sandel, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We just got another question, which I'll come to now. Do you think the integral theory developed by Ken Wilber, oh, sorry, this is from Dr. Drissacone, but do you think the integral theory developed by Ken Wilber could be similar to unification theory?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Ken Wilber's theory, but I believe that it's a type of metaphysics. So the question is, does a metaphysical approach work? I'm a little more myself. My position is a little leaning to Richard Rorty's kind of perspective. Not completely agree with him, but leaning to more hermeneutic pluralist approach, especially in light of the claim of definitiveness of the final narrative of each religious groups and theocratic countries. So I think Rawls' later Rawls' approach of overlapping consensus and agreement among different final narratives or comprehensive doctrines, the way to go. So separating political sphere from dogmatic philosophical spheres. Philosophical sphere, they claim, they try to find the final truth and leave it behind, and do not try to argue on it, and rather in the political sphere, take a more practical approach to have a consensus building. That's the way to build realistic peace. So that is the approach developing by Richard Rorty and others. So
yeah, it's very fascinating to hear about what other thinkers are thinking about. And as you've said, you're trying to develop a context also for unification thought. So and how we might develop some of these concepts in conversation with this wider sphere as well. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll go over to your final remarks, Dr. Noda. So we have a question from James Edgerly. Do you think the United States political party system, with one party emphasizing freedom, currently kind of the Republican Party, and the other party emphasizing equality, the Democratic Party, is a good basis for establishing a just polity?
Yeah, yeah. This is maybe the question given to a specialist in politics, and but my view is more plural, diverse, party system might be healthier, because for example, libertarian perspective is shared in the different ways by Democrats and Republicans. And Republicans take more libertarian approach in the economy, and Democrats take libertarian approach on the moral issues. So rather than two-party system, rather than two-party system, multiple party system is much healthier to build public discourse.
Yeah, that makes sense. And anyway, I wonder if and how and when we'll live to see that in the United States. It would be a very refreshing change, that's for sure. I think many people would feel that way. Okay, I think that brings us about to the end of our time. So Dr. Noda, if you have any final remarks that you want to kind of close this session with. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, when we try to really think about the political philosophy. Things get really complicated. For example, Richard Rorty, and when he built his perspective, he looked at changes made in Wittgenstein, early Wittgenstein, later how Wittgenstein changed his view, developed it, and he looked at Heidegger and how Heidegger developed his thought in later thought, changed it, and he looked at the whole spectrum of the development of philosophy, and he argued that modern philosophers, from Descartes to Kant, they used science, natural science, as the model disciplines. But in the 20th century, he noticed a shift, and more on the art and the literature, and those genres emerged as the sphere to tell the truth. So this shift coincides with the idea of the pursuit of the one universal theory, universal principle that fit all, one size fit all theory. That is a pretty modern assumption. And contemporary approach is truth is revealed in different ways. And that modern discipline is art and literature. And Heidegger and Wittgenstein all recognize this shift. So they moved from modern to contemporary. So Rorty pointed out behind this modern universalist ideas, there is a concept of truth, that the correspondent theory of truth. The idea should reflect the reality, and which he called mirror of nature. And so the question goes back to the what makes truth true. So a theory of truth. So he worked on the concept of truth in modern philosophers, and looked at the theory of truth, how truth is revealed in the literature and art and history, which was done by Gadamer. And so he pointed out how the truth is revealed. And so when we go back to the question of how to approach those final narratives of religious groups and theocratic state, and we have to go back to the question of how truth is revealed and how to approach it. So probably I think as those contemporary theorists are arguing, and we need to look at how to approach things. So to develop unificationism, I think that kind of critical approach is indispensable, rather than just reading founders' text. That's a Confucian style of reading and learning, but the more engagement with the contemporary discussion is healthier and I think useful for the development of ideas and thought. Okay.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Noda. Absolutely fascinating note to end on, and fascinating presentation conversation. Really just, I know, the iceberg of so much of what you've studied and looked at and are continuing to look at. And I look forward anyway to just being a part of this conversation and hearing this conversation continue. So thank you so much for your presentation today. And thank you also again, we're coming now to the end of our session. So thank you also again, Dr. Brown, for your presentation, and Angelika for moderating earlier in this session. And thank you again, everyone who was able to join us this morning. I just want to let you know that the next session in our conference starts at 10 a.m. New York time, and will cover the theme of new religious movements and contemporary threats to religious freedom. So we look forward to seeing you there if you can make it. And thank you again so much for joining us this morning.